Good afternoon, everyone. I feel really thrilled to be here to discuss one of the pressing issues of our time, ecosystem and climate actions at subnational level. Climate action is a global issue, but it's essential to have the action at the subnational level. And this morning, many colleagues already raised the question how we can involve local governments. And today, in this session, we are going to go through how we can use the fiscal tools to mobilize subnational government to take actions in those important areas. My presentation will focus on two payment schemes which have been pioneered for compensating costs incurred for biodiversity and ecosystem in many countries. Payments for ecosystem services and ecologic fiscal transfers. The payments for ecosystem, it refers to the transfers resources to private or communal landowners, or sometimes to subnational governments, to motivate them to provide, to manage the land in a way that also benefits the environment. Ecologic fiscal transfer involves the state provide a pool of resources to the subnational governments for them to comply with the national policy or take actions to protect the environment or take actions to address the climate concerns. Moving to the theoretical argument, there are three instruments that we can use to address those issues. One is regulatory instruments, fiscal instruments, and informational instruments. Regulatory instruments include building permits, protected area regulations, conservation planning, standard setting, and area zoning and planning. The fiscal instruments are used by the government to deliver and finance environmental services, as well as pricing environmentally harmful activities, such as pollution or some of the carbon emission intensive activities or products. Informational instruments aims to change the behavior of their private entities or even subnational governments. To ensure the effectiveness of all these policy instruments, irrespective which instruments you want to use, it requires the subnational governments to take action to enforce those policies, standards, regulations, and also sometimes to make investment from their own pockets to those environmental services. So this is very essential to get the subnational governments involved. However, in reality, many subnational governments are reluctant to provide adequate level of services because there are additional costs for them or because their benefits will go beyond their localities, right? So this is why the central government want to step in to use the intergovernmental fiscal transfers, provide additional resources to the subnational governments to get them, mobilize them to take actions, to work with the central government to deliver the environmental services. So the main objective of the intergovernmental transfer system is to correct interjurisdictional spillovers. Yeah, in those cases, so the central government transfers can maximize the positive externalities or minimize the negative externalities in the case of pollution. However, it is important to note that the design of the intergovernmental transfer for climate action purposes has a bearing on achieving climate-related outcomes. Okay, now let's take a deep dive on the concept of the payments for ecosystem services. The PES refers to a voluntary transaction between two parties, a payer and a payee. in which payments for well-defined environmental services are conditional on the continuous provision of the services. To successfully reach a deal of the PES, it requires the payer the maximum willingness to pay meets or exceeds the minimum acceptable level of the service providers. So that means a meaningful PES requires a well-defined environmental services and also clear understanding about the conditions for the payments. So now let's take a specific country example, China. Pan et al. Conducted a study of China's eco-compensation system. They found that in China, the PES has been used to achieve multiple policy objectives, including eco-function zones, protection of the non-commercial forests, grassroots conservation, watershed conservation, and also restoring the mining sites. And these schemes are financed by different fiscal transfers, some from the pocket of the central government, some are co-financed by the central government and the subnational governments, and some financed from the Pegovia tax. Now let's take a look at how China government really see these schemes. China has pioneered those schemes for more than, I think, over 2 decades. But finally, in 2021, the central government mainstreamed the eco-compensation scheme nationwide and issued a policy document to deepening the reform of eco-compensation scheme. According to the China government, they define the eco-compensation transfer in 2 categories. One is called vertical one, another one is called horizontal one. For the vertical one, it has been used to serve many objectives, and a very typical one is the ecological zoning protection. How this works, and this graph shows how China they define the whole country by their vulnerability of their ecological system. So they classified in 3 categories: the high-risk one, medium one, and less risky one. So for the high-risky ecological region, they are prohibited from taking any industrial manufacturing activities. And you can imagine the resistance from the local community and the subnational governments, because it deprived them from the opportunity of the economic development and also take away the tax base from the local governments. So this is one of the reasons the central government have to pay to compensate those regions for their loss. And so first is that the central government established the regulation and defined those ecological functioning zones. And then that's the regulation part. And then they define the performance of those, each of the regions. And then provide a compensation based on the compensation is more complicated. It's based on the area of the ecological zone, but also they adjusted based on the level of the income, etc. So this scheme has been used to, the transfer has been used to designed sometimes in a general transfer. That means the money, when passed down to local government, is not defined for any specific activities. So local government can use it at their own discretion for providing general public services, or when it's needed, the local government can use that to design their own local PES system to provide a compensation to the local community and households. So there are a lot of discretions at the local governments. And some of the schemes are in the form of earmarked transfer. For instance, like agricultural development, so they reoriented the existing agriculture development transfers, and by adding some ecological and environmental objectives in their own schemes. For instance, the recycle of the plastic and also the reducing the use of the chemical fertilizer, etc., all change the behavior of the agricultural production in one way or another. So what's important is that those schemes sometimes the general purpose is to compensate the loss of the economic opportunities due to the ecological and environmental protection regulations, so that local governments and also local communities could at least less resistance to comply to those environmental regulations. Yeah. But in the actual design of the compensation formula, it is mingled with other policy objectives, including the equalization of the public services, or sometimes mingled with the poverty reduction. And another scheme we called horizontal eco-compensation schemes. It is mainly used in managing watershed region to improve the water quality. And this is just an example that the Yellow River is one of the main rivers in China. This river runs across 11 provinces, and you can see that the downstream are the hubs of economic activities, and upstreams are typically those areas very ecologically vulnerable. So to encourage the protection, so the up-level government, so this is so when the river water comes down through the river, they reach a contract between the two neighboring provinces. The downstream province will pay the upstream province on condition that the water reach a defined quality standard. Yeah, but what's important here is that it requires the monitoring of their water quality at the border. So the central government, central authorities has to step in as intermediate or broker to make sure that if there is any dispute, they can step in. And also the water quality directly monitored by the Central Water Authority. Make sure that the data are credible and used by the both parties. And as we talked about earlier, to successfully reach the deal, it requires the payment that the maximum willingness to pay should exceed the minimum level of the willingness to pay of the service provider. So when there is difficult to reach agreement, the central government sometimes also step in to provide subsidies. So make sure that they can make a deal. Yeah. And also I forgot to mention that for this for this vertical ecological compensation scheme to work, also important is to have the up-level government can really monitor the performance of the environment services. The regulation yes, it's important, but if you cannot monitor the results, you cannot enforce it. Yeah, So what really changed the game is that the use of the direct monitoring, for instance, the satellite image information for the forest coverage, and also for the air pollution, there is also direct monitoring set up at the firm level, but the data are directly transmitted to the central ministry. In China's case, because China is an authoritarian regime, so local government, central government also have other incentives, can enforce the compliance of the subnational government. That's the performance evaluation and the promotion incentives. So when they use, they monitor the environment service performance, and also then in the following budget year, they will use the results to decide the allocation of the budget or the transfer to the different localities. So this is how that works. For this horizontal ecological compensation, it started with the water quality management, but now over time they also use that for the air quality management. For instance, the Beijing, the air quality is not only depend on the effort of the Beijing, but also because Beijing is surrounded, neighbored with a big province, Hebei. So the Beijing has an incentive to provide technical support and financial support to the Henan for them to enforce the air quality control. So finally, let me just summarize the key takeaway of the challenges in implementing the ecological transfer. So the practice doesn't necessarily incentivize climate action unless we can use that to link that with performance indicators to measure the actual results of the environment services. Otherwise, you won't be able to get, it's not necessarily get the results you expect. Yeah. So to make the ETFs to be effective, their use needs to be earmarked for the management of conserving ecological system or compensating for the opportunity cost of foregone lost revenues. In that sense, conditional transfers seem to be more appropriate tool for addressing special externalities and incentivizing subnational governments for climate actions. So the goal of this should not be limited to only one aspect of climate change challenges. The design of the ETF should incentivize subnational governments to take climate action in multiple areas to serve multiple objectives. So it's depending on the sectors it is being used, so you can use that in a different way. In some of the sectors, it may be very difficult to, or is very costly to monitor the final outcome, but you may want to think about any alternative indicators, for instance, in intermediate outcome or even output, for instance. So the results-based conditional grant system, of course, in theory, it is very good, but only if you can monitor the results. And finally, for the, in summarize, the payments for ecosystem services, it has been used to address the market failures, to provide adequate level for the ecological system services. In the context of a multilateral governance context, I think it's also provide very good opportunities when it is, it is combined with the intergovernmental transfers mechanisms, such as the practice in China. So there are two design options. The central government can be the buyers of the, or the payer from the subnational governments, or the central government and the subnational governments can work together, be the joint buyer to get services from the private or even lower level of the government. So in the government system, especially the monitoring system, need to be established to address hidden information and hidden action issues. Let me stop here.